talk about the thing that you are doing your thinking with today, which just thinking about your brain makes you think that I'm thinking about the thing I'm thinking with, which is a little creepy, but also really cool. Your brain is part of the central nervous system. Central nervous system is pretty much in charge of your body. The central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord. For the purposes of this lecture, we're going to spend most of the time talking about your brain. But notice that the central nervous system is called that because it's in the center of your body. If you look at this picture here, you have the brain, and then coming out of the brain, going down the very center of your body is the spinal cord. Coming out of the spinal cord are nerves. Those are called peripheral nerves, or part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? The central nervous system would be the brain and the spinal cord and the branches off between the vertebrae. Here's the brain, and I'm just going to run through the parts on this picture. This is a cross-section of a brain. This is a brain that's been cut right through. And so we can see the internal anatomy of the brain, and it's some of the inside parts we're going to talk about, but also some of the parts you can see on an outside view of the brain. We have the biggest part. The brain is about 3 pounds, and about 2 pounds of it is cerebrum. And we'll talk about what cerebrum does for you in a minute. As we go internally, this part in the middle here is called the thalamus. We have the hypothalamus. Then working down here, we have the pons, part of what's called the brain stem. The medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, made famous in the movie The Water Boy. And then, of course, or not of course, but in the back of the brain, this part called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take each part kind of in the order they are on here, except we'll talk about the cerebrum first, then the cerebellum, and talk about what they do. The cerebrum function is, it's the cerebrum you're doing your work with. The cerebrum is in charge of logic. It's in charge of voluntary control, thinking, math, I guess, which goes along with logic, senses, motion. I want to add one to this list that's not on here, personality. We'll talk about those in some detail in class. I'm also going to talk about them a little bit on this PowerPoint, but the cerebrum is kind of in charge of what you do. If you talk about something you do that's voluntary, moving your arm, that's the cerebrum. If you're thinking about your date that you had at Swirl, that's your cerebrum. If we look at the cerebrum, this picture is also in your textbook. We have this this is the outside of the cerebrum, also called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex has been divided up into areas that we know what it does. For example, if we start at the back of your brain, okay, your eyes are up here, and if we start at the back of the brain, in the very back, behind that bump on your head that males have and females don't really have, is the visual area. This is where messages come into the brain, and here is where you see and understand what you're seeing. Back here, in kind of the back, right down in here, is a little spot on the left-hand side of your brain. That's the taste area. Back here on the left-hand side of your brain is the sensory speech area. In other words, what drives the motions of your tongue and lips. Down here is the auditory area, where what you hear comes in and then you figure out what you're hearing. right along the middle. You see here it says primary somesthetic cortex. This is senses. Okay? When you sense something, it comes to a spot along in here. And we'll take a look at that in a second. Then right associated with it on the other side, in the middle of your head, is the motor cortex. What you do with what you sense. Okay? One interesting area is up here. That area is called the prefrontal area. This, we believe, is where personality lies. And we'll talk in class a little bit about how we've come to these conclusions about these parts of the brain. And just in brief, mostly it's from people that have had brain damage, or we've done operations on their brain and we've seen what these areas do. Now, another way to look at the brain is to take, let me go back a slide to show you what we're doing. Now, if we take and we cut right down the middle here in half, cut right through here, and we look at this edge, or this edge, I guess it is, at the sensory area. In your brain, along that sensory area, here is where you sense things. Okay, so if you feel something in your ring finger on your, this would be the left side of your brain, so your right hand, it comes to there, to that spot. So if I were to go into your brain and poke on this spot, you would feel that in your ring finger on that side. If I were to poke on this spot, you would feel that on your upper lip. Okay, and so on. Notice how much area is devoted to the face, counting the tongue, in your brain, and notice how much area is devoted to your whole abdominal, from your chest, from your neck to your hips. Not very much. We'll look at that in class also. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is located in the back of your brain. If you ever cut a brain out or something, you'll see this part of the brain that doesn't look like part of it. 2/3 of your brain is cerebrum, and then a lot of the rest of it is cerebellum. Cerebellum is in charge of what we call learned reflexes, or a coordination of muscles. Every reflex that you have now that I would call a reflex, like talking for many of you, walking, riding a bike, golf, playing the piano, shooting a basketball, playing catch, all those are learned reflexes. You taught your body by doing things, you learn how to do it. Okay, so, you know, your parent threw you on that bike and shoved you down the hill and you wobbled along and fell and started crying, so then they helped you up and then they put you on the bike and maybe they ran along behind it with you like I had to do with Aaron, and I was holding onto the bike and I was running along with him and he's wobbling around and freaking out, and then finally I had let go and he didn't know I let go and he was riding a bike. And then he kept practicing and practicing. He had a few biffs along the way, scrapes and bumps and bruises, running into trees, falling off the sidewalk edges, and now he can ride a bike pretty well. Well, that's a learned reflex. If I haven't ridden a bike in 6 months, I can just get on a bike and ride it. Okay? I've taught my cerebellum how to do things. My cerebellum has learned that, and now my cerebellum is in charge of those things. That has lots of implications for things like piano recitals and band concerts and dance recitals and sports. We'll talk about some of those in class a little bit. Some of the internal parts of your brain. Here on this MRI, you see the cerebrum, and here's the cerebellum. And then if you get inside, if you cut away the brain and get down inside, you see a little formation in the middle called the thalamus. The thalamus is right in the center of your brain, and the thalamus is sort of a relay center. Notice that the spinal cord comes up here, and all the nerves kind of pass through the thalamus. Almost all the nerves. The nerves for smell do not. We can talk about that a little bit later in class. So the thalamus is where the thalamus is sort of like the decider. Is this important or not? So right now, to you, let's say you've got shoes on your feet. Okay? There's been messages coming up from your feet that you have shoes on your feet. But your thalamus has been ignoring those messages. Now that you're thinking about it, it's become important to you, and so your thalamus has sent that on to the part of the brain that needs to think about it. You could be riding in a car, staring out the window and not seeing anything for miles, and all of a sudden you realize you've been staring out the window for 20 miles and you don't even remember what you saw. The thalamus is shut off. When you daydream in class, you may have my voice turned off. For what's going on in class is turned off to you. Your eyes are open, but you're not really seeing or hearing because your thalamus has shut off the messages coming from those senses. Associated with the thalamus, right down below it here, and let me erase the ink, is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the center of emotions. The hypothalamus is a connection between the nervous system and something called the endocrine system. Endocrine is hormones, like adrenaline. And again, we'll talk more about that in class. The other parts, inside of your brain, the pons. Now, these two things are considered part of what's called the brain stem. The brain stem is the area from just inside your skull to here. In the brain stem is where you get control of what we call involuntary activities. The pons, for example, is in charge of breathing. The medulla oblongata is in charge of the rate of your heart, the rate of your breathing, and any digestive reflexes. So when you vomit, you can thank your medulla oblongata. When you feel the urge to defecate, which is to go in the bathroom, that's your medulla oblongata. Has sent the contraction. We'll talk about a thing called peristalsis later in digestion. That's the medulla oblongata. Spinal cord, from the base of the brain out, is spinal cord. Spinal cord is basically just in charge of transporting messages and in charge of things that you know of as reflexes. Spinal reflexes. When the doctor hits your knee and your leg kicks, that's a spinal reflex. So those are the 7 parts of the brain that you need to know.